What if the Halloween story that finally helps you sleep isn't the one you'd expect? Forget everything you know about spooky tales designed to spike your adrenaline and keep you awake. This adult bedtime story does something radically different, something our ancestors understood but we've completely forgotten. It uses the mystery of an 18th century Halloween night not to terrify you, but to guide your overstimulated mind into the kind of deep, restorative calm that modern life has stolen from you. If you've been lying awake at 3 in the morning, mind racing through tomorrow's anxieties while desperately scrolling for something, anything that might flip the switch from alert to rest, then what you're about to experience might be exactly what your exhausted nervous system has been craving. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Most relaxing bedtime stories fail because they're either so boring your mind wanders back to your real worries, or so engaging they keep you awake to see what happens next. This calm Halloween story walks a perfect middle path, engaging enough to occupy your conscious thoughts, but gentle enough to let your body remember how to surrender into sleep. You're about to step into a full bedtime story where fireplace sounds crackle, where families navigate genuine mystery without panic, where boundaries are honored and darkness is respected rather than denied. This isn't escapism, it's reconnection with ancestral wisdom about coexisting with the unknown, about finding peace not by eliminating all threats, but by learning to maintain your center when uncertainty knocks at your door. By the end of this gentle story for sleep, you'll have walked cobblestone streets lit by turnip lanterns, felt the warmth of a hearth beating like a living heart, and witnessed how people once faced the thinning veil between worlds with grace instead of terror. This 18th century story offers something more valuable than entertainment. It demonstrates that anxiety, relief, and insomnia solutions don't always come from modern sleep hacks, but sometimes from remembering how humans created sanctuary in genuinely dark times. So settle in, let the nature sounds and peaceful story rhythms wash over you, and discover why this particular boring history for sleep is actually the least boring, most necessary thing you could experience tonight. The night is waiting, the hearth is warm, and your journey into true rest is about to begin. Picture this, a small village nestled between rolling hills, where the 18th century unfolded in shades of amber and shadow. As dusk settled over the countryside, lamplights flickered to life one by one, like stars descending to earth. It's funny how we think of Halloween as something modern, all plastic masks and candy wrappers. But back then, it was different, you know. This calm Halloween story begins in a place where every cobblestone held memory, where each doorway whispered secrets passed down through generations. The air itself seemed alive with anticipation, thick with the scent of burning peat and freshly carved turnips. This wasn't just another full bedtime story about ghosts and ghouls. No, this was something deeper, a gentle story for sleep that invited you to step back in time and feel the pulse of a world where the veil between realms grew thin each autumn. The village wasn't grand or particularly remarkable by today's standards, but it had something we've lost in our modern rush. Children darted through narrow lanes carrying their turnip lanterns, their faces glowing orange in the flickering light. Laughter echoing off stone walls like music from another era. Adults moved with purpose, securing shutters, bringing in firewood, completing those final tasks before nightfall claimed the world. There's something profoundly human about this ritual, isn't there? This bedtime for sleep routine our ancestors practiced wasn't born from superstition alone. It came from respect for the unknown, for nature sounds that grew louder as darkness fell, for the way shadows seemed to breathe. In this 18th century story, every action carried weight. Every gesture meant something. The village operated like a single organism preparing for transformation, and if you watched closely, really paid attention, you'd notice how even the dogs grew quieter, how birds settled earlier than usual. Now here's where it gets interesting, where this adult bedtime story diverges from what you might expect. The cobblestones themselves seemed to remember, as if centuries of footsteps had imprinted upon them not just wear, but wisdom. When old Thomas the baker walked to his shop that morning, his boots clicked against stones that had felt his grandfather's stride, and his grandfather's grandfather before that. This continuity, this unbroken thread connecting past to present, created something magical in these 18th century Halloween nights. The village square, usually bustling with commerce and gossip, transformed into something resembling a stage between acts, empty yet pregnant with possibility. Lamplights cast long shadows that danced and merged, creating patterns that almost looked deliberate, as if the village itself was painting stories on its walls. This wasn't the kind of Halloween story designed to spike your adrenaline, quite the opposite, actually. Think of the village as a beating heart, each light a pulse, each household a chamber working in perfect rhythm. That's the analogy that captures this moment best. Because what you're witnessing isn't chaos or fear, it's orchestration. The collective heartbeat of a community that understood something fundamental about existence, about the cycles of life and death, light and darkness, waking and sleeping. This relaxing bedtime story unfolds in that understanding, in the space between what we see and what we sense. Young Margaret hung her lantern by the door, its carved face grinning toothlessly at passers-by, while her mother sprinkled salt across the threshold with practiced precision. These weren't random acts or boring history for sleep purposes. They were threads in a tapestry woven across generations. Every gesture connected to memory, to stories told by firelight, to wisdom earned through countless autumns when the world grew strange and beautiful. The magic of this peaceful story lies in its contrasts, in how the warmth of community life stood against the approaching mystery of night. Street vendors packed their wares, their voices growing softer as shadows lengthened, almost as if volume itself recognized the shifting hour. The blacksmith's hammer, which had rung all day like a church bell, finally fell silent, leaving only the whisper of wind through thatched roofs and the distant call of ravens settling in ancient oaks. You can almost hear it, can't you? Those nature sounds that our ancestors knew intimately. The rustling and creaking and sighing of a world preparing for transformation. This fall bedtime story captures that liminal moment when day hasn't quite surrendered to night, when the ordinary world hasn't yet given way to something other. And in that suspension, in that held breath between heartbeats, the village waited, ready but not afraid, expectant but not anxious, demonstrating a relationship with mystery that we've largely forgotten. But inside those glowing homes, where fireplace sounds crackled and families gathered close, something else was beginning to stir. The transition from street to hearth wasn't merely physical, it was spiritual, like crossing an invisible boundary between two different states of being. As you stepped through the heavy wooden door, the world outside seemed to fall away, replaced by warmth that wrapped around you like an embrace from someone you'd known your whole life. The smell hit you first, always the smell. Burning oak mixed with dried rosemary and sage, herbs hanging from ceiling beams releasing their ancient perfume into air thick with comfort. This is where our 18th century story truly begins to settle into your bones. where the calm Halloween story transforms from observation to participation. The hearth glowed at the room's center, flames dancing their eternal dance, casting shadows that climbed walls like living things. For those struggling with insomnia or seeking anxiety relief, there's something profoundly soothing about imagining this scene, about placing yourself in this moment when home meant absolute sanctuary. The fire crackled and popped, those fireplace sounds creating a rhythm that spoke directly to something primal in the human soul. Inside these walls, families enacted rituals that connected them to ancestors they'd never met but somehow knew intimately. Father carved turnips at the worn kitchen table, his knife moving with the confidence of someone who'd done this every autumn for decades, just as his father had, and his father before him. The turnip lanterns weren't decorations in the way we think of them now. They were guardians, sentinels, faces carved to confuse wandering spirits, or perhaps to honor them, depending on which grandmother you asked. Mother moved between tasks with quiet efficiency, sprinkling ash along windowsills and doorframes, her lips moving in prayers so old their origins had been forgotten, only their power remained. This adult bedtime story lives in these details, in the way tradition becomes muscle memory, how protection becomes poetry. Young Sarah helped grind herbs in the mortar, the pestle's rhythm matching the gentle crackling from the hearth, creating a symphony of safety. These weren't superstitious people, not really. They were practical folks who understood that respect costs nothing and protection comes in many forms. But here's what makes this relaxing bedtime story so compelling, so different from the surface-level tales we usually encounter. The comfort wasn't absolute, it was seasoned with awareness, with that delicious tension between safety and mystery that our ancestors understood instinctively. A sudden gust of wind rattled the shutters, making everyone pause mid-motion, eyes lifting toward the sound before returning to their tasks with deliberate calm. The candle on the mantel flickered and died despite no breeze reaching it, and Father simply rose to relight it, his movements unhurried but purposeful. A creak echoed from the ceiling beams, the sound of old wood settling, or perhaps something else. Something that reminded everyone why the rituals mattered. This is the kind of gentle story for sleep that doesn't shy away from shadows, but doesn't let them dominate either. The hearth glowed like a fragile heartbeat. That's the perfect way to describe it. Because that's exactly what it was. The living pulse of the household. The thing that kept darkness at its proper distance. Think about the hearth as more than just a source of heat and light. See it as the heart of the home in the most literal sense. Every spark that rose was a prayer sent upward. Every flame that danced was life asserting itself against the vast unknown pressing close outside those walls. This 18th century Halloween understanding recognized something we've lost in our climate-controlled modern existence. Fire is sacred, warmth is earned, and the boundary between inside and outside matters more than we remember. The family gathered closer as full darkness claimed the world beyond their windows, their circle tightening not from fear but from instinct. The same instinct that had kept humans alive since the first cave fire pushed back the first ancient night. This fall bedtime story captures that gathering, that collective drawing inward, when individual worries dissolve into shared presence. Father told stories in a low voice, tales of Halloween's past, of strange encounters and narrow escapes, of relatives long gone who once sat in these very chairs. The nature sounds outside grew louder as night deepened. Wind in the trees, distant animal calls, the rustle of leaves skittering across cobblestones. The beauty of this peaceful story What makes it work as a sleep story for modern listeners battling insomnia is how it acknowledges tension without amplifying it into terror. The shadows in the corners grew deeper but not threatening. The sounds from above remained unexplained but not necessarily sinister. The occasional chill that passed through the room, despite the fire's warmth, was noted but not dramatized. Mother checked the salt lines once more, not frantically but methodically, the way you might check that you've locked the door before bed. The children's eyes grew heavy, lulled by fireplace sounds and the cadence of familiar voices, by the certainty that their elders knew what to do, that the rituals held power, that morning would come as it always had. This boring history for sleep, as some might mistakenly call it, actually contains profound wisdom about managing fear, about respecting mystery without surrendering to panic, about creating sanctuary in an uncertain world. The hearth continued its faithful work, beating steadily through the long night, and just beyond the reach of its light, just past the protected threshold, the real Halloween story was beginning to unfold in ways both ancient and eternal. The home stood as a frontier, and tonight that frontier felt particularly alive, particularly aware, as if the walls themselves were listening to what approached from the darkness, gathering strength outside. It started small, the way profound things often do, with a sound so subtle you couldn't be entirely sure you'd heard it at all. A scratching, perhaps, or maybe just a branch brushing against the outer wall, the kind of ambiguous noise that makes you tilt your head and hold your breath, waiting to hear if it repeats. Young Thomas, who'd been drifting toward sleep by the hearth, suddenly sat upright, his eyes wide and fixed on the window where moonlight struggled to penetrate the thick glass. This is where our calm Halloween story begins to shift, not into terror but into awareness, into that heightened state where every sense sharpens and the world reveals layers usually hidden. The fireplace sounds continued their steady rhythm, unchanged and unchanging, providing an anchor of normalcy even as something indefinable entered the atmosphere of the room. This adult bedtime story doesn't rush toward drama. Instead, it lets tension build naturally, organically, the way fog rolls in across autumn fields. Father's hand paused mid-gesture, his story trailing off into silence. Not the silence of fear, but the silence of attention, of recognition that the night had something to say. The scratching came again, more deliberate this time, a sound that couldn't be dismissed as wind or settling wood or any of the 100 innocent explanations we tell ourselves when confronted with the unexplainable. Mother's fingers tightened around her rosary beads, the wooden spheres clicking softly as they passed through her practiced grip, each bead a prayer, each prayer a shield. This 18th century story captures something essential about how our ancestors related to mystery. They didn't deny it or rationalize it away. They acknowledged it with respect and responded with ritual. Little Sarah whispered that she'd seen something earlier when she'd gone to fetch water just before sunset. A figure standing motionless beneath the old oak tree at the edge of the property. Not moving, not threatening, just standing there as if waiting for something, watching the house with an attention that felt almost physical. Her parents exchanged glances, the kind of wordless communication that comes from years of shared life, shared understanding, shared acceptance of truths that resist simple explanation. Here's what makes this relaxing bedtime story so effective for those seeking anxiety relief. It presents fear not as something to be conquered, but as something to be acknowledged and properly placed. The night pressed close, like a presence, listening. That's exactly how it felt inside that warm room with darkness gathering weight beyond the walls. You could sense it, that quality of attention from outside, as if the house had become the focus of something vast and patient and utterly other. But panic didn't erupt. Voices didn't rise in alarm. Instead, the family moved with practiced calm, strengthening their defenses, not through frantic action, but through deliberate ritual. Father rose and checked the salt lines, adding a bit more at the threshold, his movements economical and sure. Mother lit another candle, placing it in the eastern window with a brief prayer, her voice steady and low. The children were drawn closer, tucked more securely into the circle of firelight. Not because danger was imminent, but because proximity itself was protection. The figure beneath the oak tree, if that's what Sarah had truly seen, belonged to a reality these people understood better than we do now. This gentle story for sleep doesn't explain everything, doesn't need to, because some things resist explanation and are better honored than analyzed. In this 18th century Halloween tradition, the boundary between worlds grew thin, permeable, allowing traffic that normally remained restricted. Spirits of the dead might wander, searching for something they'd lost or never found, drawn to the warmth of living hearths and the light of family gathering. Not necessarily malevolent, just lost, confused, perhaps lonely in ways that transcended normal understanding of loneliness. The proper response wasn't aggression or terror, but respect, acknowledgement. The setting of clear boundaries maintained not through hostility, but through ritual and prayer. The scratching at the wall continued sporadically, sometimes at one window, sometimes another, as if whatever was out there was testing, exploring, seeking entry, or perhaps simply seeking recognition. This full bedtime story teaches something our modern world desperately needs to relearn. Not everything that seems frightening is actually dangerous, and not everything dangerous requires violent response. The family sat together, breathing in unison with the fireplace sounds. Their presence itself, a form of prayer, a collective assertion of life and light against whatever moved in darkness beyond their walls. Nature sounds from outside took on new character now, each rustle and crack and distant call seeming laden with meaning, with message, with the weight of a world more complex than daylight ever revealed. Thomas kept his eyes on that window, his young mind processing the impossible, learning lessons about courage that had nothing to do with fighting and everything to do with standing firm in the face of mystery. The herbs burning in the hearth released their protective scent more strongly now, as if responding to need, to the subtle shift in atmosphere that everyone felt but nobody needed to name. This peaceful story doesn't climax in confrontation, but in coexistence, in the understanding that some nights require simply bearing witness, simply maintaining your ground while respecting that other forces have their own claims, their own purposes, their own ancient rights. And as the scratching faded, replaced by a new sound, a gentle but unmistakable knock at the door, the family understood that the night's true test had only just begun, that everything so far had been merely prelude to the moment when choice and consequence would crystallize into something that demanded response. 3 knocks, soft and deliberate, echoed through the house like a question posed in a language older than words. Not aggressive banging or frantic pounding, just 3 measured strikes against solid wood, polite almost as if whatever stood on the other side understood the protocols of visitation and chose to honor them. This is the moment where our 18th century story reaches its deepest point, where the calm Halloween story transforms into something that touches the very foundations of what it means to maintain boundaries. to honor tradition, to trust wisdom passed down through generations who learned through experience what we've only encountered in sanitized tales. Every person in that room froze, not in panic but in recognition, their bodies responding to instincts carved into human DNA over countless nights when the choice to open or not open a door meant the difference between safety and something far more complicated. Father's hand, which had been reaching for his pipe, stopped mid-air and slowly lowered, his face settling into an expression of solemn determination. Mother's lips moved faster now, prayers spilling forth in whispered urgency, the rosary beads clicking their steady rhythm like a heartbeat refusing to falter. No one opens tonight. That was the rule, the commandment, the boundary that could not be crossed, no matter how polite the knock, no matter how reasonable the request might seem. This adult bedtime story carries within it a truth that modern psychology is only beginning to rediscover. Some boundaries exist, not to be cruel, but to protect something essential, something that, once breached, cannot be easily restored. The children look to their parents with questions written across their young faces. The natural human impulse to help, to answer, to respond warring with the weight of tradition pressing down through the thick air of that firelit room. Little Sarah's hand twitched toward the door, stopped only by her mother's gentle but firm grip on her shoulder. A touch that said more than words ever could about the seriousness of this moment. The fireplace sounds continued unchanged, crackle and pop and hiss, providing continuity, reminding everyone that inside these walls the rules of day still held some sway. That warmth and light and family created a fortress that worked only so long as its defenses remained intact. Here's where this relaxing bedtime story becomes something deeper, something that speaks to anyone who's ever struggled with insomnia or anxiety relief, because it addresses the fundamental human fear of the threshold, of the boundary, of that space where inside meets outside and choices have consequences that ripple beyond immediate understanding. The knocking came again, same pattern, 3 soft strikes, patient and persistent, and in that patience lived something that made the hair on every neck stand up. It wasn't the urgency that frightened, it was the opposite, the calm certainty, the sense that whatever waited on the other side had all the time in the world, had existed before this house was built, and would exist long after its timbers rotted back into earth. Father moved to the door, not to open it but to stand before it, his body a physical barrier, his presence a declaration. He placed his palm flat against the wood, feeling perhaps for cold or heat or vibration, reading the door the way a blind man reads faces through touch. His voice, when it finally came, was steady and respectful. This house is sealed tonight. We mean no disrespect, but no entry can be granted. Go in peace to wherever peace can be found. The words themselves mattered less than the act of speaking them, of acknowledging what stood beyond without yielding to it, of maintaining both courtesy and firmness in the face of something that defied easy categorization. This gentle story for sleep teaches a lesson our modern world has largely forgotten. You can respect something without surrendering to it. You can acknowledge power without granting it authority over your space, your family, your sanctuary. The silence that followed Father's words stretched long and heavy, filled with the sound of breathing, of hearts beating, of the fire doing its eternal work of transforming wood into warmth and light. Nature sounds from outside seemed to hold their breath too, the wind dying down, the rustling leaves going still, as if the entire world paused to observe this negotiation between realms. Thomas gripped his sister's hand, their small fingers intertwined, drawing strength from physical contact, from the reminder that they weren't alone in facing whatever this night demanded of them. This full bedtime story, this peaceful story born from 18th century Halloween wisdom, understands something profound about fear and respect, about boundaries and their sacred necessity. The ashes that lined the doorframe seemed to glow faintly in the firelight. Those quiet sentinels between worlds doing their ancient work, creating a barrier not of force but of agreement, of cosmic law older than human memory. Think of it this way. The threshold is where two realities meet and negotiate, where the rules of one domain acknowledge the rules of another without either surrendering their essential nature. The door remained closed, not because what waited outside was evil necessarily, but because some invitations, once extended, cannot be rescinded. Some permissions, once granted, become permanent in ways that transcend a single night or a single season. Mother continued her prayers, her voice a thread of sound weaving protection through the air, each word a stitch in an invisible tapestry that held darkness at bay, not through force, but through insistence on light, on life, on the right of the living to their space and time. The knocking did not come a third time. Whether this meant acceptance or simply a moving on to other doors, other houses, other families making their own choices in the face of mystery, no one could say. What mattered was the holding firm, the maintenance of boundary, the trust in wisdom that predated personal experience. This boring history for sleep, as skeptics might dismissively call it, actually contains more practical wisdom about managing fear, about maintaining psychological boundaries, about trusting intuition over politeness, than a dozen modern self-help books. The family remained still for long minutes after the silence settled, breathing together, existing together, their unity itself a form of magic more powerful than any individual spell or prayer. The fire burned on, those fireplace sounds speaking of continuity, of persistence, of the simple fact that morning always comes if you can just hold your ground through darkness. And as tension slowly began to ease from shoulders and jaws, as breathing gradually returned to normal rhythms, something new began to emerge in that warm room. Not relief exactly, but a deeper understanding. A recognition that they'd just participated in something ancient and necessary, something that connected them to every family that had ever faced this night and made the same choice to honor boundaries, to respect mystery, to trust that some doors are meant to remain closed. The house stood firm between worlds, protected not by walls alone, but by will, by wisdom, by the collective decision to maintain sanctuary even when mystery knocked politely and asked, so reasonably, to be let in. Something shifted in the air after the knocking ceased. A subtle transformation that moved through the room like a change in barometric pressure before a storm breaks into sunshine. The tension didn't disappear entirely, but it evolved, mellowed, transformed from sharp-edged vigilance into something softer, more contemplative, almost sacred. This is where our calm Halloween story ascends to its true purpose, where the adult bedtime story reveals its deepest wisdom about how our ancestors didn't just survive these mysterious nights, but learned to dance with them, to find harmony in what seemed like discord. Father stepped back from the door with a long exhale, his shoulders dropping from their rigid defensive posture. And in that release, you could see generations of men who'd stood in exactly that spot, making exactly that choice, carrying exactly that weight of responsibility. Mother set down her rosary with reverent care, her fingers lingering on the beads as if reluctant to break contact with their reassuring solidity. Then she moved toward the small table near the eastern window where candles still flickered their patient vigil. Now comes the part of this 18th century story that modern tellings almost always omit. The part that transforms fear into something approaching grace. The family didn't simply barricade themselves and wait for dawn, cowering in defensive posture until the threat passed. No, they understood something we've largely forgotten. Acknowledgement and boundary aren't mutually exclusive. You can honor something without inviting it into your most intimate spaces. Mother began preparing an offering with movements that spoke of deep ritual knowledge. Actions passed down through matrilineal wisdom that stretched back beyond memory into pure instinct. She took a fresh apple from the larder, one of the last from autumn's harvest, its skin still firm and red, holding summer's final sweetness. Beside it, she placed a small loaf of bread, dark and dense, the kind that sustained bodies through long winters. A cup of water drawn from the well before sunset completed the simple arrangement, and she set these items on a wooden plate that had served this exact function for more years than anyone could count. This relaxing bedtime story, this gentle story for sleep that soothes those battling insomnia, teaches through example rather than exposition. Father took the plate and moved toward the door again, but this time with entirely different energy, not as guardian but as host, not as defender but as mediator between realms. He opened the door just wide enough to place the offering on the threshold, his movements slow and deliberate, accompanied by words spoken too softly for the children to hear, but loud enough for whatever lingered in the darkness beyond. The night air rushed in, cold and alive, carrying scents of leaf mold and wood smoke, of earth preparing for winter's long sleep, of that peculiar autumn smell that exists nowhere else in the yearly cycle. The fireplace sounds seemed to respond, flames leaping higher for just a moment, as if the fire itself approved of this gesture. This bridge built between warmth and cold, between known and unknown, between the living gathered inside and whatever dwelled in the spaces outside human understanding. Here's the profound truth embedded in this fall bedtime story. The reason it works so effectively for anxiety, relief, and as a peaceful story to guide troubled minds toward rest. It demonstrates that fear doesn't always require fighting or fleeing. Sometimes the most powerful response is acknowledgement, is offering, is the simple act of saying, I see you, I respect you, but this space remains mine. The ashes along the doorframe still held their power. The salt lines still maintained their boundaries. But now those defenses were seasoned with generosity, with the recognition that mystery has its hungers, and those hungers deserve respect, if not satisfaction. Father closed the door again and returned to the hearth, and you could see in his face that mixture of relief and solemnity that comes from fulfilling ancient obligations, from doing what's right even when right isn't obvious or easy. Mother lit fresh herbs, different ones now, not protective sage but welcoming lavender and calming chamomile, their smoke rising in lazy spirals toward the ceiling beams. Nature sounds from outside seeming too quiet in response, as if the world itself exhaled tension it had been holding. The children watched all this with eyes that would remember, that would carry these lessons forward into their own lives, into the moments when they faced their own thresholds, their own mysterious knockings, their own choices between fear and wisdom. This is what makes this 18th century Halloween tradition so powerful, so worthy of preservation even in our modern age of electric lights and locked doors and skepticism that masquerades as sophistication. The family gathered close again, but differently now. not defensively but celebratively, recognizing that they'd navigated something significant, something that demanded both courage and compassion, both strength and surrender. Sarah leaned against her mother's side, her earlier fear transformed into something approaching wonder, the kind of awe that comes from witnessing adults handle mystery with grace rather than panic. Thomas stared into the fire, watching flames dance their ancient dance, perhaps seeing in their movement the same patterns his ancestors had seen, the same stories told in light and shadow since humans first learned to push back darkness with controlled burning. The night does not wish to frighten, only to be remembered. Those words, spoken by Father almost as prayer, almost as meditation, captured the essential truth of this boring history for sleep that's actually anything but boring. The house stood between worlds tonight, serving as both barrier and bridge, maintaining separation while acknowledging connection, a liminal space where different realities touched without merging, respected without conquering. The hearth at the center of it all glowed with steady persistence, that fragile heartbeat continuing its work. And in its light the family understood themselves as part of something vast and ancient, participants in cycles that stretched back to the first Halloween fires lit on Irish hillsides, to the first offerings placed for spirits who walked when the veil grew thin. This adult bedtime story doesn't end in terror or even in simple relief. It ends in understanding, in the recognition that mystery and safety can coexist, that fear properly acknowledged loses its paralyzing power, that the unknown becomes less threatening when approached with respect rather than aggression. The fireplace sounds crackled their approval, sparks rising like tiny stars ascending to join their celestial brothers. And outside, beyond the protected threshold where the offering sat cooling in autumn air, something moved away into darkness, satisfied not by entry but by acknowledgement, by the simple gift of being seen, being honored, being given its due before being asked to move along and leave the living to their living. The ashes would guard the threshold through the remaining hours of this sacred night. Those quiet sentinels between worlds, and the family would sleep eventually, wrapped in the security of knowing they'd done what needed doing, had honored what needed honoring, had maintained boundaries while extending grace, demonstrating that true strength lies not in rigid defense alone, but in the wisdom to know when protection requires not just walls but offerings, not just barriers but bridges. Not just barriers but bridges, not just fear but reverence for the vast mystery that presses close each autumn when the world remembers, just for a night, that there are more things walking than we usually admit. And that's not something to deny but something to respect as we keep our fires burning and our doors closed and our hearts open to the ancient truths that make us human. So here you are, at the end of this journey through an 18th century Halloween night. And I want you to ask yourself something honest. When was the last time you actually allowed yourself to sit with mystery instead of trying to solve it, control it, or scroll past it? This calm Halloween story you just experienced wasn't just entertainment. It was a blueprint for living in a world that constantly demands your attention, your anxiety, your sleepless nights spent worrying about things you can't control. The family in this adult bedtime story didn't conquer their fears through aggression or denial. They navigated them through wisdom, through ritual, through understanding that some boundaries exist not to make you rigid, but to keep you sane. What would change in your life if you approached your 3 a.m. anxieties the way they approached that knock at the door? Acknowledging it, respecting it, but refusing to let it breach your sanctuary. Think about the practical application here. Because this isn't abstract philosophy, It's survival wisdom for modern chaos. Tonight, when you lie down and your mind starts spinning through tomorrow's problems, what if you remembered the hearth, that steady heartbeat of warmth and light that continued burning regardless of what moved in the darkness outside? What if you treated your racing thoughts the way that family treated mysterious sounds, noting them, acknowledging them, but refusing to give them power over your inner peace? This relaxing bedtime story, this gentle story for sleep built from boring history that's anything but boring, offers you a different relationship with fear, with mystery, with the unknown variables that make modern life feel so overwhelming. The question isn't whether you'll face uncertainty. Everyone does. The question is whether you'll face it with the panicked defensiveness that keeps you awake, or the grounded wisdom that allows rest even when not everything is resolved. Here's what I want you to do, and this matters more than you might realize. Start practicing threshold thinking in your own life. Identify what deserves to cross into your inner sanctuary and what needs to be acknowledged but kept outside, honored but not invited in. Your phone notifications at midnight, that argument you keep replaying, that worst-case scenario your brain insists on rehearsing. These are knockings at your door, and you get to choose whether to open or to maintain your boundary with respectful firmness. This full bedtime story demonstrated that strength isn't about fighting everything. It's about knowing what battles need fighting and what mysteries need simple acknowledgement. The family placed an offering on the threshold. They gave respect without surrendering safety. And that's exactly what you can do with the anxieties that steal your sleep. Acknowledge them, give them their due, then close the door and return to your hearth, where fireplace sounds remind you that life continues. Warmth persists, and morning always comes, if you can just hold your ground through darkness. Are you ready to actually apply this wisdom, or are you going to treat it like every other piece of content you've consumed and forgotten by tomorrow? Because here's the real challenge, the one that separates people who transform from people who just accumulate information. Will you practice creating sanctuary in your own life the way the 18th century family created it in theirs? Will you establish rituals that ground you, boundaries that protect you, offerings that acknowledge your fears without feeding them? This peaceful story for anxiety, relief, and insomnia only works if you let it reshape how you relate to uncertainty. If you stop demanding that every mystery be solved before you can rest. If you accept that some nights require simply maintaining your position until dawn rather than achieving complete resolution. The nature sounds will continue outside your window. The unknowns will persist in pressing close. But you can learn to rest anyway, to sleep anyway, to find peace anyway. Because that's what humans have always done when they understood that safety comes not from eliminating all darkness, but from tending the light that makes darkness irrelevant. So let me ask you directly, what's one threshold in your life that needs clearer boundaries? What's one anxiety that deserves acknowledgement, but not the power you've been giving it? What would it feel like to approach your next sleepless night with the calm confidence of someone who knows that closed doors aren't cruelty, they're wisdom, and that you can honor mystery without surrendering your sanctuary to it? This 18th century story, this adult bedtime story designed for modern minds desperate for rest, has given you the template. Now you have to do the uncomfortable work of applying it, of actually changing how you respond when uncertainty knocks, of practicing the ancient art of holding your ground with grace rather than panic. Will you do it? Will you treat tonight differently than you treated last night? Or will you scroll to the next thing, hoping somehow that consuming more content will solve problems that require practice, ritual, and the courage to maintain boundaries even when they feel lonely. If this gentle story for sleep resonated with something in you, if you felt your nervous system downshift even slightly during the telling, then you need more of this. You need to keep learning how to create sanctuary in a world designed to keep you anxious. How to find rest in a culture that profits from your insomnia. How to maintain the boundaries that make peace possible. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because we're going to keep exploring these ancestral wisdoms, these boring histories for sleep that contain more practical psychology than most modern self-help. These peaceful stories that teach by example rather than lecture. The next story is already waiting, the next lesson in navigating mystery without surrendering to it. The next opportunity to learn what your ancestors knew instinctively and what you're having to relearn one sleepless night at a time. Hit that subscribe button right now before you scroll away and forget, because the journey from anxious wakefulness to genuine rest requires more than one story, more than one lesson, more than one night of practice. Your hearth is waiting to be tended, your threshold is waiting to be honored, and your sleep is waiting to be reclaimed. The question is, are you finally ready to do the work?